Hello and welcome, Erupters. This is Corinne. You are tuned in with Corinne here on the Erupt platform. Today, we are here welcomed by the lovely, talented, admirable Dr. Helané Wahbeh. I am so excited to have you here to talk about this not so talked about topic around epigenetics. And I find it to be so fascinating and so important. So, without further ado, I am going to give a little snapshot on what epigenetics is, and then I'm going to explore your science studies and your expertise, and we'll divulge from there. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Wonderful to be here with you today.
I'm so excited. So, epigenetics, I don't believe that this could be a recurrent conversation amongst our generation when it comes to health, but I personally find it to be an important highlight. Now in my 30s, I find a shift in the conversations I'm typically having with my friends. One friend in particular who is quite special, I'm going to give a shout out. Her name is Melissa Ellingson, but we often have these extremely powerful truth seeker sort of conversations. And this is, in fact, one that always hits the top of the charts at dinner or while we're on a hike. And it is always a part of our worldly conversations that we collectively like to try and understand from both perspectives, both sides of a story. So today I'm so happy to dig deeper with you on this conversation on epigenetics and how possibly past traumas from our ancestors and in our lineage can be passed down and how it can make us feel now in the present moment, which is quite fascinating. Dr. Helané Wahbeh from the Institute of Noetic Science, you have recently completed a study on genetic sciences, which is I'm wowed by. You are the author of a book titled Free to Be Me, a journey of transformation through generational healing. And I don't find any better guest to have here today to explore this conversation on epigenetics. It is a memoir, in fact, of profound generational healing that inspires and teaches us how we can overcome the chains of our past and express the power of our full spiritual and psychological potential right now. Wow. A big thank you for you joining us today. And so I'll start by giving us a little bit of a quick snapshot for those out there that have no idea what epigenetics is. And then I'd like to just pass the torch to you. So here we are, epigenetics now, the study of how our behaviors and environment can change and affect the way our genes work. The term epi is derived from the Greek prefix meaning upon, over, or beside. So epigenetics looks at the extra layer of instructions that lie over on or on top of our DNA that control the way our genes are expressed. Now, what can you let me actually dig a little deeper here. All cells in the body contain the same genetic code, correct?
That's
so
right.
Each of these cells have different structures and functions that we are aware of. A heart cell, for example, is very different from a nerve cell. So with epigenetics, it seeks to understand how this happens. It explores how these certain chemical tags attached to different parts of our DNA and how its associated proteins can activate silent genes or basically turn on or off a gene. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, so they are changeable. These modifications also help explain differences found between identical twins that share the same genetic code. So we spoke a little bit earlier, but what can you tell us about the chemical tag aspect? And is this coming from what we potentially eat, drink, and how we think?
This is a great question and such a good topic. I want to give a little metaphor to help people understand what epigenetics is, right? So we have our DNA, which is this gorgeous helix that is in every single cell of our body. And you can think of that kind of like the hardware, right? It's this set, non-changeable structure, if you will. And then epigenetics relates more to what you might think of as like the software, which is like the instructions for how the hardware works. So you might have this string of DNA code, and then what happens with that DNA code in terms of what gets expressed is what we're calling epigenetics, right? So I hope that helps your audience get it a little bit better. So the DNA is like the hardware, and the epigenetic aspects is like the software, right? So let's say that I have a specific DNA sequence related to how I handle stress. And I grow up in an environment that is very nurturing. I have enough food, water, shelter. I don't experience any external trauma. The way that my DNA gets called to produce like cortisol, which is a stress hormone, or
Mm-hmm.
respond to cortisol is likely going to be highly functional. And it's going to do a spike when some stress happens, and then it's going to calm down.
Right.
Let's say that I have the same DNA code and I am in an abusive household. I'm constantly exposed to stress. I don't have enough food. I'm constantly in that fight or flight. So the DNA is being called frequently to create more cortisol. Then the cell gets more glucocorticoid receptors to receive that cortisol. And then I have a child, and that um, sort of hyper responsive reaction to cortisol and the receptors is inherited. Now, what we're seeing with the research is that it's this really clear in animal models. So, in animal studies, you can, have multiple generations, you can watch it over time. And there is some evidence showing that it's true in humans as well, but it's not as well studied. So, there are studies with Holocaust survivors and seeing how things shift in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. But obviously, humans live a lot longer. So it takes a while longer to be able to follow
Sure.
generation to generation to see how this shifts. So back to your question, does food, environment, etc. affect us? Absolutely. And, people have had this argument for a long time about nature versus nurture. Which one is it? But it's really both. So now it's not an argument anymore because we understand that it's nature and nurture. And so we don't have, at this point, control over our hardware, our DNA structure, but we absolutely have control of those pieces that affect the expression of it. So that's the key.
That's so fascinating because it's, I mean, we have our genetic coding passed down, but there truly is scientific proof that there is this other piece to the puzzle that's just as important that I think for so much time it has never fully been addressed. And furthermore, you have a strong ability and power to adjust that adjust that gene based or the epigenetics based on your environment alone. And to now fully understand that you are in the driver's seat and you have the power to create that change, I think it's more important for us to spread the word and spread the knowledge on a subject such as this for people to truly understand more on a mental level that it's the power of now. You are at the driver's seat of your life. Every goal you have set for yourself can be shifted and can be tangible due to what your thoughts are. And obviously we spoke on the food side of it too. What we put in our bodies really does
Absolutely.
express how it affects us on a human level. So again, we're
Absolutely.
going to ask what.
Oh, I was
Sorry,
just going
continue.
to add something else there. Yeah, we were so excited to map the Human Genome Project, when we mapped the whole entire genome. And it was kind of a letdown because it was like the hardware was like, That's it. There's so
Hmm.
many other pieces that are going on. And it's funny because when they first did that, they had these pieces that they called junk DNA. They literally called it junk, right? And now, because it didn't code for proteins, but now they're realizing that the junk DNA isn't junk. It actually has a function, an epigenetic and modulatory function of the gene that it's next to. And now they call it non-coding because it doesn't code for a protein, but it actually plays some function. And we just finished a study looking at people who were highly intuitive, really in tune with themselves, and were in a really exceptional way. And we tested them in multiple ways. And we compared their DNA to people who didn't have that intuitive ability. And what was fascinating is that the difference between those groups was in that non-coding DNA of how it got expressed. So I feel like you mentioned, the take-home message to this is that we aren't a victim to our ancestry, to our genetics, that we really do have the ability to shift it based on how we behave, what we bring in our body, energetically and physically, etc. So I think it's a
Fascinating.
really important message.
It is so fascinating to me. Wow. So again, I'll unpack this more. Why does this matter? Now, epigenetics, the mechanism plays an important role in the normal development of a cell and maintaining the body's equilibrium or homeostasis, as we discussed. Any disturbance of the epigenetic process can have major adverse health and behavioral consequences. This can be affected by internal imbalances with the body itself and wider environmental and lifestyle factors. And with that being said, why wouldn't this question, you're coming from a doctor's lens, but be more prevalent specifically now during a pandemic, and even more specifically around this mental health pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are absolutely in very unique times right now, and we are seeing, huge increases in depression, anxiety, suicidality. It's very, very intense times. And so I think with epigenetics and also just health in general, mental, emotional health, physical health, what are the tools that we can use to empower people to be out of fight or flight and in relax and rest? So there's two aspects of our nervous system: the parasympathetic, which is the rest and relax one, and there's the sympathetic, which is fight or flight. And so there's so many pieces that are affected by where we're at in the nervous system. And a lot of this drives the stress response, which, like I mentioned before, is so affected in epigenetics. So there's so many different tools that people can use that can support themselves. And as an example, there's one unique tool called the emotional freedom technique. It's also called tapping. It's an energetic tool, and you basically tap on acupuncture points along your body. There's been a number of studies done on it. One of our scientists at the Institute of Noetic Sciences did a study on this with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they did this technique for a certain amount of time, and they found that there were epigenetic changes towards the positive in 6 genes that were related to stress and immune function. And so that was incredible. It was a pilot study, but it was really remarkable to see that this really short, energetic intervention that supported people to be in that rest and relax actually shifted their genetic expression.
Wow,
So,
it's like touching into the lymph system and really
yeah,
getting it to
right. So there's so many
forming it to be
tools out
alive.
there. I know there's so many tools out there. I mean, meditation is a simple one that I've done a bunch of research on. Mindfulness, exercise. And I think the take home message is to not give up and to not feel hopeless and overwhelmed or alone, that we all are interconnected. We can support each other to take those next steps to get to better health. I know there's so many people suffering right now, and my heart really goes out to them.
It's so true. I coming from a personal perspective, I have been fascinated by this subject because I've seen it play out in my own relative. My father was diagnosed with ALS and unfortunately had passed, but I know I saw the journey and the progress of how, and this is just one disease that I think can be very correlated to the liftoff just being from stress at the forefront, and how your nervous system and how your body kind of, again, the fight or flight, and how it causes a reaction and almost works in the reverse because you're not, body, mind, and soul doesn't have a proper gelling, and isn't the interconnectedness is, there's just misleading components, and it comes out in the physical. And to have seen that and get a scary glimpse and understanding of how truly our past trauma, our stress levels, our mental state really does play a strong part in our physical health.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
If I can add one more thing before question. So you mentioned the book I wrote. So that was basically my grandmother's story, and then my mother's story, and then my story, and then to my children's story of this trauma and how it wove throughout. And so if you look at it from a holistic kind of spiritual perspective, there's this empowerment when we acknowledge our ancestral trauma. So if I can look back and say, oh, wow, like they had so much trauma in their lives, and yes, this may have affected me, but then I own that and acknowledge that, then I don't have to be a victim to it, right? And I can say, I release all that. I don't need to hold that in my system anymore. And then that can empower us to make different choices in our day-to-day lives based on that. So that witnessing is like the first step, I think, to major change and transformation for people.
I absolutely believe it. And then we all in different phases of our lives experience different levels of trauma, but it's more about what you grasp, what you learn from it, and how you essentially grow from it. And you can truly own it. And it's very hard to conceive in the present, in that moment, but truly turn it into a powerful positive in how it pans out in your life and how you operate as your own individual human being.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole concept called post-traumatic growth. So we did a study with a number of different women who had breast cancer and did these in-depth interviews with them. And what was so remarkable was this post-traumatic growth, where they had this incredible traumatic experience, but they had so many learning lessons from it when they intended to have like the silver lining, that it actually supported them in their lives. This really intense, super scary health condition actually supported them to become, happier people in their lives. It's incredible to think about it that way.
It is. It's truly like you hold the key. You hold the power to making that change. So I'd love to just explore this because I'm so enthralled that how we learned about this and when, and what we still need to understand. So theory was formulated in just as far back as the 30s by Ernest Everett Just, an African-American embryologist. He put forth this hypothesis, which barely seen the light of day, unfortunately. And his hypothesis, which was called the theory of genetic restriction, clashed with the gene theory that was then becoming dominant. His model of the developing cell was strongly influenced by sociological concepts circulating within the African American intellectual community at the time. He authored more than 70 scientific papers as well as 2 books, but that were published in 1939. And unfortunately, at the time, experimental methods and other roadblocks, in fact, would have been required to test the theory, but they unfortunately didn't exist at the time. Now, stemming from the 17th century theories, epigenetics did not become a mainstream topic until the 21st century, which is wild. Why do you think it takes long for a theory to essentially become confirmed science? And how long do these theories take to get into medical literature before our doctors in the present moment have the health and better understanding on our bodies and on these topics?
Oh, wow. We could have a whole week's long talk
I know there's not enough
about
time.
academia and how academia works. Um, the simplest answer is I don't know. Like, why do some things get suppressed and other things get picked up? I will say we are living in unprecedented times with the
Sure.
internet, with social media, and the way that information is coming out nowadays is incredible. It feels like we're standing in front of a fire hydrant sometimes, right? So, at IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we're really committed to doing the peer-reviewed paper, which gets out and is judged by our peers, but then also translating that into a way that people can really understand it, that the general public can understand it, and then potentially, hopefully, depending on the results, use it in their daily lives. So why did that original discovery not come to pass? I don't really know. There's so many issues that probably played into that. But I do know that today there's so many different avenues to get the word out there about all the different research that's going on, and incredible ways, especially with artificial intelligence, AI algorithms, to be able to collate it and digest it and move us forward in an incredible way. I mean, there's just exponential growth in research studies, and we see that with COVID, how so many studies were happening quickly, and the word was getting out about what to do about it. So it's fascinating.
It sure is. I feel like there's so much more to unpack here, but we're literally coming down to our last couple of minutes. So I just want to take an opportunity to thank you for our time. Essentially, what we want to do here in this multiple stories and conversations we want to unpack is to better our society, to better our youth. And you have been a shining light. I hope that anyone who's more interested in this topic can easily find you. I know it's noetic.org where they can look more into your research around the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I just hope that even the little bit of the sparkle of the conversation we had here today at least allows for our erupters to have a spark of interest to dig deeper. Like you said, in this day and age around social media and around any topic can be Googled in a heartbeat. So to really look into this, and, I hope to maybe have like a part 2, because I think there's so much more that, just in my notes that I wanted to ask you. And again, thank you so much for your time. Here at Erupt, we have lovely conversations. We hope to see perspectives, both good and bad, but the goal is always to come together and find the great. So Dr. Wahbeh, thank you for your time. Have an amazing weekend. And thank you.
You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure being here with you today. Have a great weekend too.
Thank you so much. Erupters, if you want to be part of the conversation, just like Doctor, you are more than welcome to as well. Sign up as a guest, as a speaker through our app, and be a part of the conversations. Again, I hope we can have a part 2.
Thanks.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.